If you're like me and you're a big old Green Lantern fan, you're probably disappointed with the Geoff Thorne Green Lantern run, which ended abruptly. In fact, they never announced it was ending. It just kind of ends on issue 12. We do get hints that there's a follow-up series, but this latest iteration of Green Lantern has definitely gone out with a thud. I don't think a lot of people were excited to read more Geoff Thorne Green Lantern, although he is a big Green Lantern fan. But there are several reasons why this particular iteration of Green Lantern failed. Some of them were DC Comics' fault. Some of them are Geoff Thorne's fault. He put up this newsletter on his Patreon site. There is a link to the Thorne Identity Patreon if you would like to support Geoff Thorne, perhaps in some of his other endeavors. But he kind of goes in there, and I think he's trying to dispel some rumors, but what he ends up doing is really shedding a light on why this thing ended up failing so spectacularly. There were some key decisions made by DC upon him that did not work out, and then there were some key decisions made by Geoff Thorne that absolutely failed. There are a lot of reasons people didn't like this series. I think the fact that Hal Jordan isn't really present was a big factor. I think the fact that it had really terrible art is another factor. And you can definitely tell there was some tinkering along the way. I personally lay some of the blame on Geoff Thorne himself, and we'll talk about that. But there's definitely some blame that goes to DC Comics for bad planning and pushing bad ideas on Geoff Thorne. So we're going to get into some of the comments. I would definitely like to hear from you if you're a Green Lantern fan. Why didn't you like this Geoff Thorne Green Lantern run? And if you liked it, tell everybody why you did like it, because I don't think many people actually did. Perhaps you could persuade some people that were in the middle that maybe it was better than they initially remembered it. Now let's get into the details, because there is a lot of information here. I'll try to keep this under 20 minutes. One of the first things that caught my eye was him talking about including Jo Mullein. After he was signed on to write Green Lantern, he said once negotiations were complete on that score, there was the matter of some stuff going on in the rest of the DCU that impacted Green Lantern. Things that the company wanted to happen regardless of the plot of my story. And if I wouldn't mind, could I include Jo Mullein from Far Sector as one of the main characters? They may have asked me to use Teen Lantern as well, or it might have just been my idea. I honestly don't remember. Wait, now I remember it was my idea. I wanted Teen Lantern so I could flesh her out, fix her. And oh yeah, the central power battery has to go. Speaking about DC Comics mandate, I quibbled about using Jo Mullein, not because she's not an awesome character, but because she is both awesome and unique, and I'd be the first person to try writing her after her creator. N.K. Jemisin is Jo's creator. Hugo and Nebula award-winning writer N.K. Jemisin. She's a beast, world-class writer. Far Sector was everything a sci-fi comic needed to be with Isaac. I would humbly disagree on Far Sector. It's not the worst comic of all times, but it's certainly not even in the top 100 Green Lantern comics ever. A character without a lot going for it, to be completely honest. She kind of looks stupid. The design is really, really dumb. I don't think this Far Sector stuff was ever supposed to tie in to the regular DC Comics universe. It never felt like it was supposed to. DC Comics have gone out of the way to make her unlikable, claiming that she's the multiverse's greatest detective, of course, usurping Batman. Also claiming that she's the next great Green Lantern and going to be a member of the Justice League. Okay, whatever. Why include this character? Obviously, DC Comics sees something in the character Jo Mullein that the fans don't. And eventually, the fans are always right. The customer is right. And they have decided that they don't want to support Jo Mullein as a regular Green Lantern. As far as Teen Lantern, I don't know how he really fleshed her out or fixed her. As far as I know, he put her in a coma, and then she doesn't have powers anymore. I think she's the only human Lantern that doesn't have powers anymore. I don't know what that did to fix a character. From a Green Lantern perspective, from a reader's perspective, I appreciate it. Teen Lantern was a shitty character when she was created by Brian Michael Bendis, and she was a shitty character when she was heavily included, especially on the cover art of Geoff Thorne's Green Lantern run. So there you have two main characters, Jo Mullein and Teen Lantern, that everyone hates, and they were heavily included in there, especially on the promotional art, the covers and whatnot. And that absolutely doomed Geoff Thorne's run from the very beginning. But it does get worse. He gives some information about Future State. Future State felt like an absolute shit show, and there's a reason why. Somewhere during the middle of my plotting, my half of the giant Green Lantern book, Mike calls me, what he's referring to there is initially Geoff Thorne's book was going to be like the backup story. There was going to be a main story written by a much more prominent, well-known comic book writer. But he gets the call from Mike, hey, we're doing the Future State thing. Can you give us a quick John story that takes place in the future of your arc? He asks how far in the future. Mike says your call. He says, sure, I can do that. How soon? Mike says, ASAP, please. Cool. So that's where Green Lantern Future State comes from. Not surprisingly, almost all of Future State sucked. There are a couple of standout issues, a couple of standout stories in there. Unfortunately for Geoff Thorne and DC Comics, the John Stewart Green Lantern book kind of sucked. Once again, because of the art, because Tom Rainey was the artist, and it just blew. Who wants to read a full Green Lantern story where there's nothing before it or after it with no Green Lantern powers, no power rings? It's just John Stewart leading some weird aliens. It's not the worst thing in the world, but I mean, the art is. Let's be honest on that. The story wasn't the worst thing in the world, but it wasn't that good either. No Green Lantern fans sign on to read a book with no Green Lantern powers. It's just a stupid idea, and you can see it was absolutely hastily made, it was rushed, and it came out that way. A lot of Future State sucked, and you can see why. Now, he did address the ongoing turmoil at DC and how that affected his story. He even talks about initially he was hired by Dan Didio to do this story. He pitched him a bunch of different ideas, and this is the one that they chose. Obviously, Dan Didio, I believe, got fired 2 weeks after he signed his contract, but there was more upheaval in the cards, and this is what he has to say about the turmoil at DC Comics at the time. In addition to personnel cuts, personnel jumping ship, rapid promotions, and editorial group reassignments happening backstage at a hurricane pace, leaving DC editorial woefully short-staffed by the time it was done, big-name writer left the new Green Lantern book high and dry. So, with this all unknown to me, I'm informed about a week prior to announcing the book, all of this backstage stuff, and hey, what did I think about being the solo writer on the book? I certainly cannot begrudge Geoff Thorne jumping at this opportunity. As he states, in the newsletter, someone gives you an opportunity to write one of their big-time characters, you jump on it. Obviously, he was already working on this John Stewart story that we kind of got fleshed out in full in his 12-issue run. But he was never supposed to be the main event. His John Stewart story was supposed to be the backup story, and it was kind of pushed on him at the last minute. Obviously, he would have had to tinker with the story. He talks about that a little bit more and flesh it out more and add a lot more to it. And they would have been doing this all at the last second as the book was being announced, but it wouldn't have been ready by then because there was supposed to be, another 2/3 of the book being handled by another writer that was more prominent to DC Comics fans. I don't think that's on Geoff Thorne. That is absolutely on DC Comics. Just like those other mandates, like adding Jo Mullein into the book. Obviously, Teen Lantern is a Geoff Thorne issue because that was his idea, according to him. He does go on to talk about some of the changes that were being made and one specific character that we know that he hates, Hal Jordan. Never mind that this caused a massive deck reshuffle of my story, a lot of which had to be rejiggered to accommodate this upheaval, and fold in that I have absolutely zero interest in writing Hal Jordan-focused stories, ever. All of this I was clear about, and to all of which DC said, no worries, do you. Hal would be in it because, of course, he would, but not the focus of the arc or a major player in its biggest points. Kelly was, that's Teen Lantern for those of you who don't know. Joe was, Simon, poor Simon, was also in because, fuck it, I like it. This major issue that certainly helped doom this Green Lantern run, obviously is all on Geoff Thorne. We know Geoff Thorne hates Hal Jordan. And as far as I can tell, he hates Hal Jordan more than any other comic character in the history of the world. I don't know why he hates Hal Jordan, but he hates the greatest Green Lantern that ever lived, and he begrudgingly added into the story. Now, he didn't embarrass Hal Jordan. He certainly didn't do that, but he wasn't front and center. He was never really on the covers until the very end. But quite frankly, right now, in the here and now, Hal Jordan is the reader's Green Lantern. And to not have Hal Jordan play a central role, a prominent role in this Green Lantern series was absolute stupid. Geoff Thorne should have known that. DC Comics should have known that. But DC said, you do you, Geoff, and we'll see what happens. Obviously, we saw what happened. The book sucked, sales tanked, and nobody was interested in it. Not having Hal Jordan was a stupid strategic decision. And that one's on Geoff Thorne. Another huge reason this Green Lantern run sucks, and I've mentioned this already, is the art by Tom Rainey is fucking awful. And I do mean just the drizzling shits. It is the worst art conceptually I could ever see mixing with the Green Lanterns themselves. You did a nice, clean, sleek comic artist to really do a good Green Lantern story. Geoff Thorne should know that. DC Comics should know that, but they decided to go through it. This is what he had to say about Tom Rainey. I asked for and got Tom Rainey as the artist on the John story, and as the book had already been structured to be two distinct storylines, we thought it would be good to have a second illustrator come in and tell that side of the story in a different tone, as that story itself would be written. Enter Maestro Marco Santucci. Marco Santucci's art looks fantastic and right at home in this Green Lantern series. Unfortunately, he's illustrating the fucking Jo Mullein, Teen Lantern, Simon Baz stuff nobody was interested in. And Tom Rainey was doing the yeoman's work on the main story featuring John Stewart. Tom Rainey is not a Green Lantern artist. He never should have been, and this is all on Geoff Thorne. He sabotaged his own book by asking for Tom Rainey by name. Obviously, they had worked on the Future State Green Lantern stuff, but choosing to go that route absolutely torpedoed this book, because even if the story was good, it looked like shit. It really did. It looked like complete dog shit, and I don't have anything against Tom Rainey, and I think he would be great on a Masters of the Universe comic or a Garbage Pail Kids comic, but on a Green Lantern Cosmic Hero Journey comic, it just never fit. It was a terrible decision, and that one is on Geoff Thorne. As far as the mandates and what he needed to do that came down from DC Comics themselves, this is kind of the way he wraps it up, and there's also a big contradiction here. There were no other real bumps after that. We all just got down to tell the story of the 3 proposed arcs, which is now complete and being annotated here. Then he talked about the story would be in 3 arcs: Invictus, Horatius, Terminus, and he talks about how those 3 arcs initially would have been 8 issues each before he walked away. Obviously, we didn't get an 8-issue arc. We got a 12-issue arc. So something changed. He ended up bloating it by 4 extra issues, and there were some changes to the story. It's hard for me to believe that there were no other bumps along the way. Something obviously happened, and he finishes talking about the mandates from DC Comics. So those are the mandates plus one more, and this is something both parties wanted. There are too many damn human lanterns. Maybe do something about that, please. Check. So these are the mandates. Take over the book. Check. Include Jo Mullein's. Check. The central power battery must die in some fashion. Check. As I mentioned earlier, I must have missed the part where he got rid of the other human lanterns. The only one that's not a lantern, I believe, anymore is Teen Lantern, Kelly, because her gauntlet is gone and she has no powers anymore. We didn't see Guy Gardner, and we certainly didn't see Kyle Rayner, but there's no indication that they're not Green Lanterns anymore. They just weren't a part of the story, which I think is stupid, because those are much more popular Green Lantern characters than Jo Mullein's or Teen Lantern combined, but whatever. But he did do what he was supposed to do. He did include Jo Mullein's to the detriment of the book and the sales, and he did kill off the central power battery by the end. I don't think these are changes that people like, but that was obviously on DC Comics themselves. That wasn't a Geoff Thorne issue. He included that because that's what DC Comics wanted. And from the words of Geoff Thorne himself in this Patreon newsletter, it was not only Geoff Thorne that sabotaged this Green Lantern run. It was DC Comics themselves. It was about 2/3 Geoff Thorne. Sounds like it was about a 1/3 DC Comics. They made him include Jo Mullein. Didn't need that. But he decided to keep Teen Lantern around. He's the one that pushed for Tom Rainey. He's the one that decided, I will never do a Hal Jordan story. All the detriment of his own reputation and sales. And at the end, people were glad to see the comic go. This isn't a Green Lantern run that'll ever be really remembered. And all the changes that he made will either be forgotten or retconned at soonest. As soon as there's another competent Green Lantern writer on the series, they'll undo it because they were bad changes in the end, even if they weren't all his decision. Now, I imagine you're a Green Lantern fan if you made it to this part of the video. I have got something for you. The 5 best Hal Jordan stories of all times. Geoff Thorne might hate Hal Jordan, but I love the character. He's got the best Green Lantern stories out there. More good stories than John Stewart, Guy Gardner, and Kyle Rayner combined, in my opinion. But these are the 5 best. Definitely check this out and let DC Comics know Hal Jordan is the greatest Lantern for a reason.